So I just want to begin by saying that I blame this sermon actually on Ilse and Lloyd. It's true that Jack presented all of the I am sayings to us in a staff meeting, and we all kind of said, wow, I am the door. Never heard a sermon on that. And Lloyd and Ilse said, oh, Annie, that sounds like it would be a challenge. So that's what I call peer pressure. And here we are. So thus far in our series, we've heard a sermon on Jesus saying, I am the vine, and a sermon on Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. And tonight we meet Jesus, the gate, the door, the entrance, perhaps. It seems like the least natural of these metaphors that we've heard so far. The text is very richly layered and sort of an extended metaphorical speech. And it's important to situate this discourse following after chapter 9 of John's Gospel, in which Jesus has just healed a man who was blind from birth. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with the story, Jesus healed a man, and his friends who knew him took him to the Pharisees to find out what exactly had happened, what had transformed that he could now see. And in this story, the Pharisees question the man, and they discover Jesus' involvement, and they kind of want to know, what is this Jesus person up to? So they question him, and thus begins this dialogue where Jesus launches into this metaphor about shepherds and sheep, and he talks about wolves who are a danger to the sheep, and then he says that he is a gate or a door. And at first glance, there appears to be absolutely no correspondence between the event of the healing of a blind man and then this response, this discourse that Jesus is giving as he answers the Pharisees and explains what he's just done. But according to one theologian who I've read, Caroline Lewis, we need to be more attentive to the very subtle and subversive comparisons that Jesus is making. We heard in Sarah's sermon last week about what shepherding was like in first century Palestine, how it's unsafe to leave sheep out on the hillsides grazing at night. They had to be gathered in a pen or an enclosure and locked to keep anything from going in or coming out. And that's exactly the kind of the picture that would have come to mind to the Pharisees who were listening to Jesus. Only here Jesus is insisting that he is the gate, and whoever enters will both come in and go out and find pasture. So I wonder if you hear anything odd in that. Jesus is not a gate intended to keep the sheep in. He says exactly the opposite, that his sheep will come in and go out freely. You can almost hear an echo of the words of Psalm 121 that talks about the Lord watching over our coming and our going forevermore. And it sounds so beautiful and it sounds so liberating. But it's also actually really, really odd. What kind of gate lets the sheep go in and out? The purpose of the gate is to keep the sheep in and to keep them safe. So as it turns out, reading this, I think Jesus appears to be a really lousy gate. Maybe a broken gate. So the metaphor, we see it's complexified. The Pharisees, who had just interrogated the blind man and were now listening to this speech, were in the very fullest sense gatekeepers. They were pietists, they were scholars, guardians of the oral tradition of Jewish theology. They understood themselves to care for the people of God by gatekeeping. They protected the people of God from the threat of disregarding tradition or disregarding the law. The blind man himself, who is now seeing, is an affront to this very neatly ordered way of seeing the world. He was a blind man, so by law, he was unclean and excluded from temple worship. But now suddenly he's a seeing man, and now what do we do with him? He doesn't fit into the categories anymore. So it's rather understandable that the Pharisees reacted by actually expelling the man from the synagogue, by excluding him from their community, because their primary concern is with being a gatekeeping the law, more so than the well-being of this one particular person. Jesus provides quite a contrast in his response. After he restores the man's sight and the man is expelled from the synagogue, Jesus goes and seeks him out. He finds him and actually invites him to come and join his community and to become a disciple. And disability theologians would point out that this is the entire point of the passage, actually. For the man, Jesus' great work was not necessarily giving him sight, but rather welcoming him into a community. Just like the sheep in the metaphor, this person had followed the voice of Jesus even before he could see him, and he entered the gate with the hope that this gate would lead him to life in abundance. So that's what I've been reflecting on as I thought about this passage and this very tricky metaphor and the fact that I'd never heard a sermon about it before. The theologian Elizabeth Johnson writes that the Pharisees were acting as closed gates. Exactly what gates are supposed to be. Trying so very hard to guard against all that could possibly threaten the well-being of the sheep, that they became fixed and they became rigid and locked down, and they were unable to swing open when God did the unexpected and the unpredictable and came crashing through. Now, Jack is not allowed to answer this question because I know he already knows the answer, but I will ask the rest of everyone here. Does anyone happen to know the motto of the Anglican Communion? Believe it or not, we have a motto. We have a flag, which is also very odd, but we have a flag, and at the center of the flag is written in Greek, a motto. I would say that I'd give something to someone who knows the answer, but I don't have anything to give, so I'll just tell you. The motto is, "The truth shall set you free." I don't want to end this sermon by doing the Pharisees a disservice. I think if we make them the villains of the story, if we make them into these sort of stupid caricatures who don't have faith and can't understand who Jesus is, we're doing them a great disservice. The Pharisees were devoted to the truth. They loved the Jewish theological tradition. They guarded it. They were the locked gates. That was the only truth that they knew. But then the world turned upside down when the truth came to us not just as a law or just as a catechism or a confession, but came as a person. And this person, this truth, came saying, "I am the gate, and whoever enters by me can come in and go out freely. My sheep will know the truth, and the truth will set them free." So perhaps I'd rather leave us with a question. What would it look like to have the kind of daring and courage it would take to go out from the gate? Not to stay in the safety of the enclosure with the sheep, with the locked entrance, which makes us feel secure and safe, but to really go out from the safety of that and to embrace a riskier truth, and to venture like the blind man, in case we might have life and have it abundantly. Amen.